Welcome to today's interesting topic on the Trans-Saharan and transatlantic trade routes. We're going to see the trading systems, goods traded, and the economic impacts on these Saharan and Atlantic trade routes. Many old African empires traded with the Europeans because there are lots of natural resources in Africa. So, what was the Trans-Saharan trade and who was involved in it? Trans-Saharan trade conducted across the Sahara Desert was a web of commercial interactions between the Arab world. The Arab world includes the North Africa and the Persian Gulf and the Sub-Saharan Africa. It was called the Trans-Saharan trade because the trade was involved across the Sahara Desert. And so that was where it got its name. So the main objects of this trade were gold and salt. Gold was in abundance in the western part of Africa, but scarce in North Africa. We had other items like copper, we have diamonds, okay? So these products were exported to Europe and Asia, Arabia, and India in exchange for ceramics, silk, and beads. The major seaports on the northern coast of Africa were the Tunis and the Tripoli, such as Timbuktu and Gao in Mali. Even Kano in Nigeria became trading centers from which these gold, ebony, and salts were sold. So African empires were rich in gold. Men dug the gold from the soil, women washed and separated the gold from the dirt, and the result is what is known as gold dust. These products were finely secured in feathers and carried across the Saharan desert. Okay, even camels carry these caravans and products across the Sahara under the scorching heat of the sun. What the African countries needed for the exchange of their gold was salt. They live in hard conditions, the perspire, and then they needed to replenish the lost salt. The salt trade between the Western African civilization and the East Muslim nations flowed for many years. In addition to salt and gold, beads, cotton cloths, dates, copper, pottery, ivory, ostrich feathers, and kola nuts were carried by caravans across the desert. They exchanged customs, food, and ideas such as the Arabic writing systems. Okay, so we can see all these as benefits. So the Trans-Saharan trade introduced Islamic religion, okay? So we refer to this trade, like I said earlier, as the Trans-Saharan because they traveled across the Sahara Desert. So goods that were traded across the desert include perfumes, cowries, silks, ostrich feathers, like we said before, horses and camels, hide and ivory. So the cheap medium of exchange was the cowrie shell. Okay, so the Trans-Saharan trade did not only involve gold, it also involved people. Like we said, gold and salt. African empires started to sell slaves to the northern traders. So we have important trading cities during this Trans-Saharan trade route. We have cities like Timbuktu and Gao in Mali. We have Kano in Nigeria. So these areas were the places where this trading took place. Let's look at the importance of the Trans-Saharan trade route, okay? So farmers and fishermen living near the cities became more productive to meet the demands of the city dwellers. Traditional rulers became very prosperous from taxes they collected. In Ghana, the Asante Kingdom flourished from its huge exports and import duties. The revenue from the trade was used to provide amenities for the people, such as well-maintained roads. So armies were well-maintained and thus security were increased around these kingdoms. Okay, then through the trade with the Berbers from the north, Islam was introduced into many of these empires that were involved in the Trans-Saharan trade. So this trade actually changed the way of life in many of these African countries, especially with the introduction of Islam. So the spread of Islam to sub-Saharan Africa brought social hierarchy, gender inequality. It brought education and investor systems that we are seeing today. And seeing the meaning of the Trans-Saharan trade, the kinds of goods sold, and then the medium of exchange and the important trading centers. Let's look at the transatlantic trade. Okay, the transatlantic trade. What is it still all about? So the name came from the fact that the goods were being traded across the Atlantic Ocean. Across these trade routes, goods and humans were traded. Humans were traded for slaves, so the Europeans. In the 16th century, Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, sailed around the west coast of Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope to India. His journey paved the way for Portuguese traders to begin trading directly with the West African kingdom. Some West African kings began to capture people to sell as slaves to the Portuguese traders in exchange for weapons and goods such as silk and ceramics. So the British joined the slave trade in 1500, shipping slaves to the Americas. The demand for slaves grew so much that the Portuguese started to raid African kingdoms for slaves. Slavery is a terrible practice. People sold as slaves did not have any rights or freedom. They were considered property. Europeans discovered that African people were skilled farmers and miners, so they wanted them as slaves. Okay, it was believed that many millions of Africans, almost 7 million Africans, were shipped to the Americas during the slave trade. Most of them died and were thrown into the sea, and some couldn't make it. Okay, the slaves wore iron chains around their necks, hands, and feet. They were chained together and not allowed to move around. Many died of hunger and diseases. So African slaves were shipped to the North and South America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Arabia. Okay, so now the colonial rule in Africa, like we said earlier, the Europeans had discovered that Africa was a land rich in natural resources and they were anxious to own it. They wanted to use these natural resources to develop their own industries and countries. Then the Berlin Conference of 1884, European heads of state attended the conference and it was decided that they would take all African continent except for Liberia and Ethiopia, which was under European rule. So countries that colonized Africa include France, Britain, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, and Italy. Okay, so the African territories that the Europeans owned were called colonies. Africans fought against the seizure of their lands by the Europeans, but however, the Europeans had better weapons and were able to defeat Africans. So today, because of the slave trade, there are people of African descent all over North and South America and the Caribbean. So let's talk about Olaudah Equiano. Olaudah Equiano was a slave boy who was kidnapped from his home and sold to a member of the British Navy. Okay, he wrote a book about his experiences, okay, how he suffered in the hands of slave trade. But today, the story wasn't the same. So many Africans have not seen white people before, so they consider them as cannibals that always come and take people away for their selfish gains. In order to stop their suffering, some of them stabbed themselves to death, or some of them committed suicide to stop the suffering meted on them by the slave masters. Women and children were kept in the dark and abused by the crew, and the men oftentimes were made to dance and entertain the colonial masters. So we ask, what happened to the Africans who reached the New World, and how is the impact of this slave trade affecting their generations today? Not only did Africa lose its able-bodied men, okay, the long-term effects of this dehumanization had a very negative impact on Africa. In 1807, slave trade was outlawed in Europe and the Americas. So African empires that depended on this trade for economic boom, they started collapsing, and so they became weak and were now susceptible to the colonial masters from Europe. And then there were influx of ammunitions and killings among different empires in Africa. Christianity tried to outlaw slave trade. but the slave masters believed that Africans are supposed they are inferiors and as such should be made to be slaves to others in Europe. Thus, slavery in Europe and America acquired racial basis, which made it impossible for people from slave descendants to have equal opportunity with the Americans. The slave trade had a huge injustice, which its impacts it's so bad even after its abolition. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found this lesson educative. We talked about the meaning of the trans-Saharan trade, the kinds of goods sold, medium of exchange, the trading centers, and why the Europeans needed slaves. So try and upload your assignment, your video response assignment to avoid compiling work. Be good.